Now, women earn less than men in every advanced economy in the world. This is despite a slew of policies aiming to redress the balance and years of discussion about the topic. According to the United Nations, for every dollar a man earns, a woman takes home just 77 cents. Efforts to address the issue are well underway, but at the current rate of progress, it would take 257 years to close the gender pay gap. A recent study by the journal Nature Human Behaviour has taken a closer look at the issue. Researchers looked at the situation in several advanced economies. You can see a sample of them here, and the difference in pay between men and women in each one. Now, the study came to some interesting conclusions, which my colleague Arthur Sullivan has been looking into. Let's get the breakdown from him now. Hi, Arthur. Thanks for coming on. I'm wondering, this study seemed to really upend some of the assumptions we have about the causes of the gender pay gap. Why is that?
Yeah, so one of the big underlying assumptions which has been behind a lot of the research that's been on the gender pay gap for decades now is that the majority of the issue around the pay gap comes from things called sorting and segregation issues in terms of jobs. So that basically means that women end up in lower paid sectors. Now, obviously, there are structural discrimination within that, in that a lot of those sectors which become, in quote marks, feminized, are structurally undervalued. But what's fundamentally different about this study is it shows that to a much larger extent than previously thought, what's known as within-job inequality is actually responsible for half the pay gap. Now, that means men and women doing essentially the same work, but being paid less. So it's not because women are doing different jobs that are typically paid less, it's because they're actually simply paid less, even though they are in the same job. And that accounts, according to this study, for roughly half of the pay gap in the 15 countries that are profiled.
OK, so if we know that this is happening, the obvious question is, what can we do about that?
Well, one of the things that the authors of the study say that's so important for this study is that there's different sets of policies required. So in cases where it's the segregation issue, it's important to encourage women to come into jobs which are better paid. But this other issue, this within-job inequality, is more difficult to deal with, but there is one consistent policy thread that's required, and that's pay and wage transparency. Now, there is some work being done on that. For example, the EU has brought in a directive which should come into effect across the EU over the next 2 to 3 years, which would dramatically change the rules on wage and pay transparency, would give employees the right to get quite specific details on pay structures within their organisations, also would prevent employers from asking them about their own salary expectations, things like that, and would also give workers the right to pursue claims if they feel they've been unfairly discriminated. Now, that's one of the key areas that needs to be addressed. Germany has brought in its own law in this regard a few years ago, but there's a lot of criticism of that law. For example, one of the big ones is that you must have at least 500 employees for a lot of its requirements to come into effect. So hopefully for those seeking a closing of this pay gap, this EU directive will be a big changing point.
I want to talk a little bit more about Germany specifically, because it has one of the highest gender pay gaps in the EU, and that's despite some pretty progressive policies. You mentioned efforts to change there, but looking specifically at parental leave, we have this very generous policy where mothers and fathers can divide their time equally, but that doesn't seem to happen. Why is there a motherhood penalty here and no fatherhood penalty? Yeah,
well, it's one of the really interesting things about this study, and the authors themselves have said that Germany is a bit of a puzzle to them, because Germany does indeed have those progressive policies, one of the best paternity benefit systems in the world. And yet there is this consistent motherhood penalty in Germany, and also a pay gap which does lag behind a lot of the equivalent sort of peers in Northern Europe especially. Now, it's hard to say exactly why that is, but one of the things is that women, because of pre-existing inequalities, tend to be in the lesser paid roles. And so it's a self-reinforcing issue that women will tend then to take a little bit more leave, obviously, as mothers. Also, because of the fact of pregnancy, they will tend to take a little bit longer. There may be health issues during pregnancy and things like that, and they may miss out on opportunities during that period. It also tends to occur that women often will get pregnant in their 30s, and that's obviously a critical time in career development. So there are these issues that need to be addressed, and again, policies have to come in to further level the playing field for women to take into account these issues. Another issue, very briefly, within Germany is that a lot of its economic edge comes in industrial sectors, and there still is not enough representation of women in those areas.
OK, Arthur Sullivan, thank you so much.